Chapter 486. Muslims for Humans does some good. 0821Z Tuesday, December 31, 1996 Baghdad Atlantis DEFCON status 2/5. 4% Stanislav Drakel didn't really like the idea of fighting a battle in a mosque. Although he himself was not Muslim, waging war in a sanctuary designed for religious contemplation was rather distasteful. Unfortunately, he didn't have much of a choice in the matter. Intelligence reported that the Death Eaters had held the high-ranking Iraqi officials hostage in the mosque, possibly expecting the wizards to be reluctant to attack a house of God. They had also turned the mosque into a heavily defended fortress, desecrating the place even further. Drakel was indeed reluctant to attack the shrine. However, what else could he do? He had orders, and orders had to be carried out. He tried to console himself with the thought that Allah would not have approved of a mosque in this format. If that was the case, he was enforcing God's will with this attack. At the moment, however, he wasn't anywhere near the mosque. Rather, he and his platoon were pinned down by a large number of Death Eaters in an office building about a block or so from the mosque. Thankfully, the office building was deserted, so there was an easy way to deal with it. Making sure that his comrades were covering him, he took off his Atlantis ring and waited for the bubble to wink out. There was no way he'd be able to contact the Muggle command post with the bubble up. Although the bubble kept all sorts of radiation and energy from entering, it had a notorious tendency to block transmission in the other direction as well. He lifted the walkie-talkie to his lips. "Echo Base, this is Rogue Leader. We've got some problems here. A large number of Imperial stormtroopers on Hoth has pinned us down. Request assistance, preferably an iron cannon strike." The Muggle general on the other end of the line answered quickly. "Rogue Leader, this is Echo Base. How far are you away from the enemy?" "About a block and a half." "That's too close. The iron cannon can do a lot of damage. Is there any way you can get out of the way while making sure that the stormtroopers don't follow you?" Drakel grunted. "I'm not sure, but I'll do my best. And if I don't, I still want you to attack. I've got a personal shield after all." "Acknowledged, Rogue Leader. We'll send a strike over there in a couple of minutes." "We will." The signal dissolved into static as one of his colleagues yelled, "Sir, they're coming out." Dropping the radio, he jumped out in front of his men and slid the Atlantis ring back onto his finger. Seconds later, 3 Avada Kedavra beams slammed into the shield, which rang like a bell. Drakel longed to fight back. However, they were still operating under DEFCON 2 rules of engagement, and as a result, the Atlantis bubbles would not permit him to use his weapon to attack the enemy. His colleagues, who did not have Atlantis rings, could. However, they couldn't shoot around him in the narrow alley. Anything they fired at the stormtroopers would be blocked by Drakel's own bubble. There was one thing they could do, however. Pointing his wand further down the alley, he said, "Heads up, everyone. I've called in a strike. That building with the Death Eaters is going to be tomahawked in a minute or so. Let's get further away from so that we don't go up with it." His second nodded. "Sounds all right with us. Let's go. Let the shield down momentarily so I can make sure they don't follow us." Drakel's brow furrowed. "I can only have it off for a second or so before they realize what we're trying to do. You have to understand also, Hector, that I won't be able to defend you." Hector nodded. "I'm aware of that and am willing to take the risk." Hoping that this wasn't the last time he'd see Hector in this world, Drakel took off the ring and shot a stun beam at the Death Eaters as Hector ran past. The Death Eaters, in turn, responded with an Avada Kedavra just as Drakel got the ring back on. Hector ducked, and it slammed into the newly restored Atlantis bubble. Hector promptly retaliated with a few more curses, backing slowly away from the Death Eaters at the end of the alley. Suddenly, the man serving as rear guard shouted, "Sir, Death Eaters just entered the other end. We're trapped, Og." Drakel spun to see a red beam hit the rear guard in the head, dropping him like a sack of grain. Beyond him, at the other end of the alley, were more Death Eaters. Drackle had the strong suspicion that both sides had been caught off guard by this encounter. This was a problem. There was only one Atlantis bubble to go around, and that was in the middle of his unit. Drackle wasn't in a position to ensure that his entire unit was safe. It looked like he would have to choose the lesser of two evils and consider the second group of Death Eaters the main threat. After all, the first group could only target Hector, and he had taken cover beyond a few trash cans. A veritable rainbow of beams shot out from Drackle's unit's wands, followed almost immediately by another rainbow from the newly arrived Death Eaters. By the time the smoke had cleared, 4 Death Eaters were down along with 5 of Drackle's men. To make matters worse, the new arrivals were screaming for backup, and more Death Eaters were running in their direction. Frantic, Drackle watched as one of his lieutenants transfigured the body of one of the dead soldiers into a brick wall. Drackle approved of the idea. Unfortunately, someone evanesced the wall approximately 3 seconds later as even more people, this time in Muggle dress, began running towards second group of Death Eaters. Drackle heard a groan behind him and spun to see Hector fall with a burning hole in his robe. Fortunately, the Death Eaters stayed behind in the building, sitting targets for the upcoming missile strike. Drackle understood their reasoning. With their opponent completely blocked by an Atlantis bubble, what good was it to come out and expose themselves? There were more shrieks, and Drackle turned back to see roughly twice as many Death Eaters at the far side than there had been earlier. Half of his men were now down, and one of them was acting strangely in a way which suggested he was under the Imperious curse. If this kept up much longer, Drackle would be the only person left to report this disaster to HQ. Suddenly, a staccato popping sound burst out from beyond the Death Eaters. It took Drackle a good 5 seconds for him to realize what it was, a machine gun. Although he was grateful for the support, he could have sworn that there were no machine gun units anywhere in the vicinity. Death Eaters shrieked and fell to the ground in droves, and the remainder suddenly cursed and start pointing their wands at the newcomers. Deadly beams burst forth as 3 familiar words suddenly exploded from the general vicinity of the machine gun. Muslims for humans. Several of Drackle's men gasped, and Drackle himself did the only thing he could think of. Lower your wands and let Muslims for humans take care of them. Do not use magic against them. The fight between the Death Eaters and Muslims for humans men lasted a good 10 seconds before a tremendous explosion caused everyone on both sides to turn towards the office building, which was a smoldering ruin. Nothing could have survived that attack, nothing. The road was clear to the main Death Eater stronghold, if the Muslims for humans units would let them through. At the moment, the Muslims for human soldiers were finishing off the Death Eaters and cheering the destruction of the office building. Acting on impulse, Drackle tore off his ring and moved to the rear guard's former position, reactivating the ring between the Muslims for humans men and the rest of his unit. Several Muslims for humans shouted and aimed their guns at Drackle's men. Drackle watched their leader, however. It was obvious that the leader recognized the bubble surrounding him and what it represented. Much to Drackle's relief, the leader raised his hand and told everyone to hold their fire. Drackle nodded and put his wand back in his pocket. Thank you for your support, gentlemen. We thought we were goners there. I'm Stanislav Drackle, acting leader of the 1st Division of the Wizarding Standing Army. I take it you're associated with Muscleism for humans. The leader of the Muslims for humans cell nodded. Indeed. I am Lieutenant Anton, and these are my men. I can tell you are from Atlantis, Mr. Drackle. Although for the most part, we do not entirely trust wizards, we learned enough during Judgment Day to understand that there are good wizards as well as bad wizards. It is fairly obvious which is which in this case. That's good to hear, Lieutenant. I take it you're here because a Muslim nation is under attack by wizards. Correct. An idea formed in Drackle's head, and the Durmstrang deputy headmaster indicated his men. As you can see, we are not attacking you. In fact, my wand is not in my hand, and this bubble will protect our men from any attacks, either ours or yours." Anton nodded. "That is consistent with what I have heard." Drackle spoke carefully. "I propose a truce for the duration of this fight. It's obvious both of us are being inconvenienced by the Death Eaters, and both of us will benefit from our ridding Iraq of them. What do you say?" Anton spoke with his men for a few minutes. The discussion was fairly heated, but Anton eventually started speaking firmly enough to get his point across. Finally, the rest of the group nodded, and Anton turned back to Drackle. Anton smiled. "As Allah is our witness, we have a truce until the Death Eaters are gone from Iraq." "Good. Now let's join forces and raid that headquarters building. We deal with the wizards, you free the hostages. Given your distrust of magic, we will not cast any magic spells on you without your permission. Since there are hostages there, and it's a religious shrine, try not to use weapons unless you have no choice." Anton nodded. "Fair enough. Let's go." Kurd partisan base northern Iraq. Agent Barbour looked at the television broadcast and whistled. "Well, look at that. It appears that the government and wizards are finally making progress against the Death Eaters running the country. I wouldn't be surprised if we get rid of those assholes." Agent Bahota nodded. "Indeed, and this brings up a rather fascinating development." Barbour smirked. "Let me guess. With Saddam dead and the government crippled, there's a wee bit of a power vacuum right now. Not to mention that Iran and Saudi Arabia are on Iraqi soil as well." An astute observation. Now, if I'm reading this right, the government is non-functional and needs some assistance. And if the government can't be saved, it is up to us to make a new government. In the latter case, deft political manipulations can make the Kurds power players in that government. Barbour chuckled. "I'm confused, Bahota. Are you advocating control of the government in Baghdad or independence from the disintegrating state of Iraq?" "Whatever works, my friend. The point is, if there's a time we Kurds will truly be able to make ourselves felt, it is now. If we're lucky, we'll be in charge when the dust from this fighting settles." Drackle turned around the final corner and held up his hand. "Mister Anton, tell your men to back off. They've got the door guarded. 1st Division members, stand next to me and face off against these guys. Aim into those slots. Make sure you're partially covered by the man in front of you, and make sure the lead men are covered by my Atlantis bubble. Hurry." Beams of multicolored light flashed as the auras arranged themselves into a wedge shape. A couple of the wizards went down, but reserves quickly took their place. Anton watched as his new allies returned fire. Judging from the expressions on their faces, their opponents were putting up a good fight. Anton wanted to help, but he didn't know how. He tried to get one of the wizards' attention, but all that managed to do is distract him long enough to get him gunned down by a blue laser beam. He caught a brief glimpse of the entrance to the Death Eaters' headquarters. The door, as it was shut, and people were shooting multicolored light out of slits in it. No wonder the attackers were having so much trouble. They were effectively trying to raid a medieval fort with the enemy firing out of arrow slits. He watched as a multicolored beam shot out of one of his ally's wands and crashed into the door a few inches away from the slits. The door simply absorbed it as several more beams burst out from behind it. A groan betrayed the fact that one of the auras had been hit. Suddenly, one of the auras in the back of the wedge walked over to him. "This is getting nowhere, which means we have to get creative. Mr. Anton, please tell me one of you has a hand grenade or something equivalent." Anton floundered weakly. "Well, I suppose we have a—" The wizard cut him off. "Will it knock down the door? I'm just hoping that they haven't hardened it against Muggle explosives. Guns aren't enough." "Oh, yes, but—" "Give it to me. I'll make it invisible while you throw it at the door." Anton gaped at him. "Now wait a minute, The wizard threw his hands up, then dodged out of the way as a purple beam missed him. "For the love of God, a hand grenade." The last sentence was spoken in a whisper, and Anton still wasn't entirely certain what exactly the wizard had said. However, the Muslims for Humans leader's eyes widened as a hand grenade suddenly flew past him towards the wizard. The wizard reached out to grasp the grenade and was promptly struck by one of the beams shot from the door. Anton watched the man go down with a thud as the grenade rolled around the ground near him. Anton wasn't sure how the grenade had gotten over there. However, he knew what to do with it. Figuring that those beams wouldn't be accurate enough to hit a small object like the grenade, and that they wouldn't be able to hit it once it got too close to the door, he reached for the grenade, pulled the pin, and tossed it towards the door. The grenade bounced off Dracul's Atlantis bubble and landed at one of the other wizard's feet. Anton shrieked that it was live, and the wizard alertly grabbed it and cast a spell which delivered it to the base of the door and attached it securely to the bottom. Dracul told everyone to get behind him, and they managed to do so just in time as a colossal explosion ripped through the early morning light. When it cleared, the door was still intact, but the entire frame had been blown to bits. The wooden panels comprising the door itself were lying on the ground, completely intact. Dracul motioned with his wand, and both Muslims for Humans and Auras roared as they charged the compound. They stopped short, however, as Dracul held up his hand once more. The door is booby-trapped. The Atlantis bubble is registering interference with a spell in the doorway. Hold on a second, while Oleg here gets rid of it. Anton watched as one of the other wizards pointed his wand at the jagged hole in the wall. Oleg uttered the word, finite, and the hole briefly shimmered with a white light. Dracul motioned forward once more just as several more enemy beams crashed into the Atlantis bubble. Dracul blocked bolts while one of the other wizards raised his wand and shouted, Revelio Muggletum. Anton winced as the spell detected him, and it took him a few moments to realize that the wizard was using the spell to figure out where the hostages were. The third wizard smiled and pointed upwards. They're upstairs, directly above us. Dracul, completely unconcerned about enemy attack thanks to the Atlantis bubble, turned to Anton. You and your men should find your way upstairs and rescue the hostages. We'll deal with the wizards out here. Do you want any of us to go with you? There may be magical defenses you'll need to overcome. I'm only asking first because I know you're uncomfortable about magic in general. Anton figured Allah would have agreed as well, given that the wizards were working on the side of good this time. We'll take a wizard along with us. However, I'd appreciate it if we were the ones to actually rescue the Iraqi officials. The hostages may not be happy if they see wizards running at them with raised wands. Dracul nodded and turned to Oleg. Oleg, go with them. I'll deal with the wizards down here. I suspect the prisoners are left lightly guarded since we're actually invading the complex right now. And Anton, I'm telling you in advance we're taking the machine gun in here. Now move. Anton and Oleg moved off as Dracul and the rest of the wizards began to make their way deeper into the compound. However, he didn't go far before he saw a building map on one of the walls. There was only one staircase, and it was at the other end of the building. They would have to go through all of the defenses after all, it seemed like. Oleg shook his head and grinned. I don't think so. Watch this and get out of the way. Anton watched as the wizard pointed his wand at the ceiling above and shouted two words, Silencio, Reducto. There was a flash of light, and the ceiling immediately above Oleg broke apart. Debris fell to the ground, revealing a hole in the ceiling. The sound of the falling pieces of plaster was soon accompanied by the stuttering of the machine gun in the main room and the sounds of spells being shot off in all different directions. Oddly enough, the explosion itself had made no sound. Presumably, this had been done to not alert any guards upstairs. A yellow beam suddenly appeared out of nowhere and took down one of Anton's men. Oleg spun, fired something into the smoke, and turned back to Anton. Have your men cover me. I'm going to send you up there to free the captives. Anton blinked. He issued the orders, and he nodded in approval as his men began trading shots with the wizards. Turning back to Oleg, he asked, "Me, I can't fly. I don't know if." Oleg pointed his wand at Anton, and the Muggle fell silent. "I'm sorry, but there's no other way to get this done. Levicorpus." Anton bit back a shriek as an invisible hand lifted him into the air. He went sailing through the opening and soon found himself on the second floor in the middle of a group of prisoners. He recognized several of them from Iraqi news reports. There were no guards visible. However, Anton figured it was only a matter of time until the Death Eaters figured out what was going on. He turned to the first prisoner and began untying his bonds just as Oleg launched another Muslims for Humans member through the opening. Within 30 seconds, 5 prisoners had been freed. Anton began working on prisoner number 6 when he heard footsteps in the corridor. Reaching for a brick, which had been blown back into the second floor by the reductio explosion, he stood next to the door to the prisoner's room and waited. A few seconds later, someone shouted for the prisoners to stay where they were and for their rescuers to freeze. Anton's response was simple. He hit him on the head with the brick. The Death Eater crumpled, and the rescue continued. There was a sudden howl downstairs which suggested Oleg had been hit. There was a scuffle for a moment, and then suddenly all noise downstairs ceased. It sounded like the battle was over. But who had won? Anton herded all the prisoners together and asked them how to get to the nearest staircase. One of them remembered, and they all started heading in that direction. They were just starting down the stairs when they heard a large group of people coming upstairs. Quietly lowering the brick, Anton reached for his sidearm as the first glimpse of the enemy came around the corner. It was an Atlantis bubble. Anton lowered the weapon as Drackle led the wizards around the corner and onto the second floor. The prisoners cheered loudly and pressed Drackle for an update. Drackle smiled. "We got all of them. Had it not been for our friends in Muslims for Humans, we'd have been hard-pressed to pull this off. But pull it off, we did. Thank you, Mr. Anton, for providing that machine gun." It took out a good 90% of it, and the rest of the wizards took the remainder prisoner after they were injured. It's a pity we lost Oleg there at the end. Anton smiled. "You're welcome, Mr. Drackle. I never thought I'd be fighting side by side with a wizard for the benefit of humanity. If we're lucky, we'll come to our senses and agree to not kill each other once this battle is finished." Drackle laughed. "I hope that's the case as well." 0900Z, word soon began to spread that the Death Eaters had been eliminated in Baghdad. However, the battle in Iraq was not yet over. Rumors were spreading that one of the dead Death Eaters had invoked a death curse which would mine the Straits of Hormuz, something the world truly did not need. Oil refineries were going up in smoke, and a few of the airfields in other parts of Iraq were starting to host dragons instead of aircraft. There was a report where a dragon had bitten off the wing of an airplane only to find itself blasted out of the sky by a heat-seeking missile. The surviving 1st Division members, along with their new Muslims for Humans allies, were immediately ordered to one of the airfields to eliminate one of the remaining pockets of Death Eater resistance. By 9:15Z, the combined Muslims for Humans and 1st Division unit had liberated their assigned airfield. During the battle, Lieutenant Anton was killed by a dragon. He was mourned by both Muslims for Humans and wizarding forces, and his successor immediately agreed to maintain the truce with the wizards against the Death Eaters. It looked like the tide was slowly starting to turn in Iraq. There was still a lot of work to do, but it was definitely progress. 1,000 Atlantis, ladies and gentlemen, the time has come for our ground invasion of Bouillon. May the 5 gods be with us. ===0400Z Tuesday, December 31, 1996 Old Roman Fort Bouillon. Grigory Varlamov struggled to relax to the point where he could get some sleep. The missile attacks had just ended, with the result of Rasputin moving even further into the valley to protect against any interference whilst he tried to bring back the Black Guard. As he slipped into his sleeping bag, he heard a loud, hollow, sucking noise, then the caterwauling charms going off. He and the others present at the fort, along with the others tasked with defense all over the island, sprang into action. He pulled out his wand, pointed at the direction of the noise, and yelled, "Pratigo." A shimmering light confirmed his success. The noise grew until it was almost on top of him. Could this be the end? The Muggle Christian guard bringing down his vengeance? His fears were all for naught as two F-16s screamed overhead, making the loudest noises he had ever heard, flames pouring out of their behinds. They flew over and banked hard to the southeast, heading towards Turkey. F-16 CJ 892047 AV 510th FS buzzard 2115 000 feet over the Black Sea, 5 miles southeast of Buyan and climbing. Mark 0.95 Tuesday, December 31st, 19,960,405 Z. Hot damn, Pancho. Best flying I've had since the exercise at Spadedham, Captain Nick Mongo Miller exclaimed through his mask. His wingman, Captain Pete Pancho Barnes, replied, "Yeah, I know, Mongo. Probably gave them boys a good scare." "Damn right we did. You see them fucks scatter." "Roger." "How's your Italian girlfriend right now? Ain't her brother part of that wizarding army they're staging?" "Yeah, she's been worried sick per the phone calls we've had. The jarheads will make sure nothing happens to him." "Roger that. Let's get back to Constanta." FA 160,395, AC 203, VF 32, Gypsy 31, 5,000 feet, and climbing over the Black Sea, 15 miles south of Buyan. 550 plus Caius Tuesday, December 31st, 19,960,455 Z. Lieutenant Commander Jack Firkin Grigsby pulled back on the stick of his F-14, taking the Tomcat to an altitude that would clear the Buyan Superdome, yet still be in range to get good quality photos. The pilots, especially those detached to Mihail Kogalnisanu International Airport in Constanta, started making comparisons to the football stadium in New Orleans after the failed Tomahawk attack. As of yet, nobody made any jokes about the Saints playing the damned, but that would change. Gypsy 32 climbed to 7,000, advanced to mill power. His wingman, Lieutenant Fred Dason, Weeks responded, "Roger, Firkin." "Island dead ahead now, 8 miles, piped up Firkin's radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Commander Sean Guru Whitmer. Grigsby responded, "Roger, Guru." Gypsy 32, arm your camera. "Roger." Dason's Rio, Lieutenant Junior Grade Tom, Redrick, flipped a few switches to turn on the cameras in the top's pod, slung underneath in the tunnel between the engines. The pod would give Minister Flamel and the other senior commanders the best imagery available, 5 miles out, and the Tomcats leveled to 7,000 feet. "Don't get down too far, Dason, else Guru's bonking your wife when we get back. Don't count on it." "Yeah, sure." "Excuse me, Grigory Yefremovich, this is Firkin at the desk. It is your 0500 wake-up call." The jets engaged their afterburners just before reaching the coastline. The plan was to be supersonic, or damn close to it, as they passed over the main part of the island. Central Valabine Tuesday, December 31st, 19,960,500 Z. Evgeny Borodin groaned inwardly. The caterwauling charms were going off again, and that godforsaken noise, like giants rolling down a hill, was back. Suddenly, silence. Borodin cast the shield charm and looked overhead. 2 grey arrows streaked over, almost too fast for the eye to keep up with. The arrows suddenly sprouted wings of white, and a horrendous thunder-like noise could be heard. As soon as the noise started, it stopped. Borodin started thinking, could this be a message from the guards? The flybys kept coming, the latest by 2 B-1s based out of Diego Garcia, a long trip for these crews to perform a Mach 1 flypast. They met their tanker and recovered to that small group of islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. This one was 8AS from Spangdahlem, who stayed around for a little bit, making mock attack runs from 10,000 feet to the imposed hard deck of 8,000. The concrete practice bombs made loud thumps upon hitting the dome. The 13 rounds from the huge Avenger cannon made sounds like hail hitting a car roof. Men were being driven out of their minds. 850 South Beach Buoyan. Vladimir Konstantinov walked his patrol inside the dome near the southern beach of the island. Cradling his Akam rifle in his arms, close to his chest, he expected no surprises, no sudden arrival of Atlantis wizards. The half-vampire Muggle was sure of his decision to join the Black Fist militant group, if not only to get away from St. Petersburg and the continued troubles after that bastard, Mikhail Sergeyevich, started the path to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. A dark spot in the corner of his eye caused him to stop and turn so the objects were centered in his vision. He gazed upon the shapes of the US Nassau and US Vicksburg in abject horror. Even more worrying, he thought he could see tiny wakes in the water. He turned to run towards the tree line, where the command post stood, screaming Amerikancy, Amerikancy, all the way. Bridge, US Vicksburg, CG-69, Black Sea, 8 miles south of Bayern Tuesday, December 31st, 19,960,900 Z, 1100 EAT. Gun crews report ready in all respects, Captain. Very well. Captain David McCullough picked up the mouthpiece. Fore and aft gun crews, commence firing. Bells rang and horns sounded as the 5-inch guns roared in anger, shooting over the marine Amtraks making for the beach. Vultures Row, US Nassau, La Four, Black Sea, 8 miles south of Bayern Tuesday, December 31st, 19,960,930 Z, 1130 EAT. Hermione Granger stood on Vulture's Row, looking at the Arves sailing towards the beach of Buoyan and the hive of activity on the Nassau's flight deck. 2 Cobra gunships sat on the far edge of the deck, ready to launch when given the word that the dome had fallen. A Harrier was being lifted on the aircraft elevator to the flight deck. 2 black helicopters sat at the front part of the deck. Those MH-6 little birds would fly her, Moody and Flamel, along with a fire team of us Navy SEALs from the highly secretive Team 6, to the general area of the Central Valley, where Rasputin was likely bringing Kashay back to a corporeal form. She moved her eyes from the helicopters, which freaked out Moody to no end, to the area of the deck that contained her real and hopefully lasting contribution to the cause. 60 mannequins, bought at cost from Constanta boutiques, were being made to look like wizards trying to apparate in. Delayed portkeys were being attached to the lifeless foam dummies, along with wizard clothing and blood bags, to make it look like they really went splat upon reaching the shield. The Russians would call it a maskirovka, an illusion, a great fake designed to make the fatigued enemy on the island have second thoughts on where the invasion was actually going to take place. The plan was to have real wizards apparate in, but Hermione was able to convince Dialanis, with the help of Marines, that if Rasputin cast a dome over the island to keep bombs and missiles out, then it can only be logical to assume that he cast anti-apparition wards as well. He took it well as anybody can take having their plan torn to shreds by a 17-year-old girl and a couple big men in funny clothes with splotches of green and brown all over. She reached into her back jeans pocket and pulled out a small picture, somewhat worn and wrinkled, but if it got too far gone, she could always repair it, and it would be good as new. The picture was of her and Ron, taken at a photo booth on the pier in Brighton, a rare moment in time when 2 teenagers could act like, well, 2 teenagers. The trio went down to Brighton after Hogwarts let out for the summer and before the nuclear blast in the Ministry of Magic. Ron and Hermione were able to sneak off and have time to themselves, which culminated in that visit to the photo booth. She smiled inwardly at the memory. The sound of turbines winding up snapped her back to reality, and she looked at the 2 cobras readying for flight. She was so focused, she didn't hear the footsteps beside her. Penny for your thoughts, Granger. Oh, you startled me, Major. Major Darlene Scarlett O'Hara, a Cobra pilot, took pity on the scared 17-year-old when she arrived on board yesterday, reflecting on how scared she was when she reported to Annapolis for plebe summer. Sorry about that, sugar. But really, how are you feeling? I'm scared, terrified, really. This isn't how I envisioned spending my winter break. I just hope this isn't the last one, she choked out, glancing down at the picture. Is that your man? O'Hara asked, looking over. Yes, Ron. We've had it for each other since first year, but we were too stupid to realize it until recently, she chuckled. When King William came to Hogwarts, he was so jealous, he even punched him, right in front of the King Mum. Sounds like he's loyal to a fault, bless his heart, especially if he punches the King of England in front of his mama. Oh, he's a darling, she said after looking at the picture. You hold on to that boy, you hear? If you keep those memories close to you, you'll make it home after this mess winds down. This can be something you tell your kids someday. He truly loves you, and not in that teenage crush kind of way. He was willing to punch the King of England for you. At Hermione's perplexed expression, she added, Honey, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I'm a born and bred Southern girl, and we Southern belles like our men to be strong and loyal. As long as they're respectful to us and to others, and work hard, we don't mind if they get a little green with envy once in a while. As far as I am concerned, that boy's a good catch for you, and you need to get back to him as soon as this little dust-up's settled. Hermione took in the elder woman's words, then reached into her left front pocket and pulled out a folded-up piece of lined paper. Major, if I don't make it off that bloody island, I want you to deliver this to my parents when you have the ability to. She handed it to O'Hara, and she took it and shoved it into the breast pocket of her flight suit. You're getting it back after it's all over, you hear? You got too much to live for. You do your job here and get back to your boy and screw his brains out, and punch out that minister of yours for pulling a stunt like this. Drafting a girl with no combat experience and throwing her into the fight. If you'd have been my daughter, I'd have shoved a shotgun into his face and dared him to take you. Now, you got any chow yet? Hermione shook her head. Her stomach was turning too much to even think of the prospect of breakfast. Come on, you need to go into battle on a full stomach, and the cooks are pretty good for being squibs. Granger Residence, 15 Blakesley Avenue, Ealing, Greater London, Tuesday, December 31st, 19,961,000 Z. Evelyn, do you need help with the dishes? I can have Ronnie help you. No, it's fine, Marley. I'll just throw them into the dishwasher. Ah, dishwasher. How does one of those things work? I rinse the dishes, put them in the rack in side tops for cups and mugs, and the bottoms for the bigger plates and the utensils. Measure the correct amount of soap and push the button. Absolutely amazing. Be careful to not let Dad hear you say that, Mum, chuckled Ron, walking into the kitchen. His face turned to a solemn and depressed look. Mrs. Granger noticed. Don't worry, dear, she'll come back. Yes, Ronnie, she'll come back. Any girl that can stand you is too strong to be defeated by those wretched Death Eaters. Ron replied sardonically, Geez, thanks, Mum. Just then, Mrs. Granger yelped in surprise. That idiot, Reggie, that moody fellow didn't fix the sink like he should have. Her husband, Reginald Reggie Granger, responded from the living room. Can you do without it for a couple days, love? B&Q's closed for New Year's. She responded while walking in with Marley and Ginny. I could use the slop sinks for a couple days, but only a couple days. If I need to cover your appointments, so be it. Okay, dear. The morning show anchors suddenly changed from talking about the newest store in Milton Keynes to a more serious tone. We have been informed that the King Mother is addressing the nation about the recent events in Iraq and in the Black Sea. We divert from our original programming to bring you to the royal residence in Windsor, Berks. My fellow Britons, I appear on your screens and on your radio speakers not only as Queen Regent, but also as a fellow citizen. As I speak, United States Marines and British Wizard forces are conducting an invasion of Buyan Island, off of Romania. These forces are tasked with stopping perhaps the greatest evil we have faced since the events over the summer, and indeed, since the start of recorded history. The brave men and women of the Second Wizarding Army may not be your sons, daughters, sisters, brothers, and friends, but they are Britons, defending this country against the greatest evils in the magical world. Before a young man named Harry Potter flew through a commercial for the Super Bowl, the magical world remained largely obscured from our eyes. But ever since then, we have had our eyes opened to this hidden world. We have witnessed great triumphs and even greater sorrow and devastation. The events that propelled me into this position of great responsibility showed the world both the absolute worst and the absolute best that our shared humanity can offer. The nuclear attack in London caused great devastation and loss of life, but one girl was determined to save as many lives as she could. Hermione Granger was working at her parents' dental practice when the attacks occurred. Without thinking of her own safety or well-being, she endeavored to save as many lives as she could. Using magic, she created shelter and distributed lead vests to mitigate against the effects of radiation and undoubtedly saved many lives. I have come to know this young woman personally as a classmate of my son, the future King William V. She does have a family, a mum and father that love her very dearly and are proud of her every achievement. She has a loving boyfriend, unyieldingly loyal, willing to confront even the future King of England to defend her honor. I know that she will do everything in her power to help stop this latest evil in defense of her nation. I fervently pray that she, and the others that have been enlisted in fighting this depraved man, Grigory Rasputin, do not experience failure and that they return to their loved ones. If some must give the ultimate sacrifice, may our Lord hold their families in his comforting hands. May God bless the Second Wizarding Army, the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit, and all those who are fighting for freedom around the globe, and may he grant us an everlasting peace. There was not a dry eye in the house. South Beach Buoyan, 1000 Z. The Arves crawled onto the beach, the engines rising in pitch to provide the additional speed. They raced off the beach to the coastal plain, receiving no resistance. A crewman in the lead Arv announced that he could see people on the other side of the plain, in the tree line. They were approaching the platoon of vehicles, but stopped 1,000 yards in front. They appeared to be forming a line. Igor Romanov, sitting in the commander's hatch, spoke through the intercom to the driver. Shield barrier in range. About 500 more meters then will breach. Gunner, be ready to engage. Aye, Sir 40 Mike and the Mar-Deuce are ready in all respects. Okay. The 15 Arvs reached the dome and then went through. Using the tactics developed in the Battle of Diagon Alley, all of the Arvs were magically enhanced to drive through the dome without being adversely affected. They all went through. That's when the enemy started shooting bullets and firing off spells. The rounds and spells pinged off the hulls harmlessly. The roar of the M2HB.50 caliber machine guns and the 40 Mk19 grenade launchers in the vehicle's turrets roared to life. The rear hatches opened up, and Marines and Wizards stormed out and began to move forward. The Marines responded with their training in infantry tactics and squad movements. Still, some went down, often while pulling down their Wizard counterparts when they decided to stand up at the wrong time. A few Wizards also paid for their mistakes with their lives. The Marine Wizard team still moved forward, Marine machine gunners providing covering fire for their fellow Marines and the members of Second Wizard. The half-vampires, Muggle and Wizard alike, provided stiff resistance, often recovering from being shot multiple times. It took a coordinated effort between the dismounted platoon and the Arvs to defeat the threat. They soon eliminated the Muggle half-vamps, but the Wizard half-vamps proved a tougher nut to crack. Igor Romanov led the effort, locating the half-vampire with the Elder Wand quickly due to the unusual strength of the spells being launched from that direction. He dove behind a tree and pulled out his gun, reasoning that the gun would be less likely than the wand to have trouble with the Elder Wand. Removing his ring so he could fire without having the bubble in the way, and using the tree for cover, He drew a bead on the Elder Wand's owner when he was distracted and promptly shot him in the chest. The vampire howled and collapsed, forcing Igor to react quickly before the Rasputinite healed himself. Taking careful aim, Igor disarmed the vampire to gain control of the Elder Wand and promptly summoned it to his hand. Elated, he screamed into his communications device, "I've got it. I've got the wand, finite incantatum." The magical dome that protected most of the island came down in a shimmering light. Corporal Darnell Perkins spoke into his radio. "Nassau, Griffin 2-1 actual, the Superdome is open. The Superdome is open." The Marines' and Wizards' elation were short-lived, as the Atlantis shields suddenly disappeared and more Rasputinite wizards popped up on the ridge in front of them. "We need to pull back," yelled Pierre Ribau, an Atlantis wizard. Perkins yelled back, "Fuck that." Another Marine yelled, "Corporal, we need to go ugly early." Perkins spoke into his radio. Any Allied aircraft, this is Griffin 2-1 actual, requesting fire support." Griffin 2-1 actual, Abraxan flight. 4AS with 30 Mike and 500-pound bombs, where you need us. Abraxan 2-1 actual, I need you to obliterate the ridge. Give them everything you got. Roger, what's your position? 300 yards south of the ridge. Wait 1 Abraxan. Corporal Perkins turned to Ribau. "Can you shoot sparks from that thing?" "Yes, but..." "No, but's wizard. Shoot some sparks or we're overrun." Ribau raised his wand, said a few words, and red sparks came out from the tip. A10 81-952, SB 81st FS. Abraxan 21, 1045 Z Tuesday, December 31st, 1996. 2-1 actual, have your position. Dropping 300 yards north of your line. Boomer, Humor, Nacho, drop on my line. Next pass with the gun. 2, 3, 4. Major Tom Bowie Smith nosed over and put the nose of his warthog parallel to the ridge. The pipper in his heads-up display showed where to drop, and he pushed the button on his stick. 12 500-pound bombs fell from the aircraft, and white balloons sprouted from their tails. Wump, 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 wump. The ridgeline became a wall of fire and debris as the bombs found their mark. The other planes followed suit. A second pass wasn't really needed, but for the sake of completeness, Major Smith and his flight rolled in going for guns. The roar of 13 bullets hitting their target was heard before the BVRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRR Grasping the elder wand in his hand, Igor stood up, fully intent on moving forward. He reached for his ring so he could put it on and insulate the wand from further attacks. Too late. A wet thud was heard as his head exploded in a red mist, then the crack of the rifle that did him in. "Sniper, stay down!" Corporal Perkins crawled to the other squad leader in his area. "Did you see that, Frank?" Corporal Frank Cummins responded. "No, man." Sounded like it came from the summit. "Fuck! What the?" Perkins trailed off as he saw the elder wand zoom off into a copse of trees. He thought he heard a small pop as well. "That wand, it's gone." Another wizard made to stand up, but Perkins hauled him down. "Stay the fuck down. We need to go after the wand. Not with that sniper up there, we don't." Flight deck, US Nassau 1045Z. After hearing the message on the radio about the dome being brought down, Hermione, Moody, Flamel, and 5 very mean-looking men in camouflage ran to the little birds and strapped into the bench seats on the outside of the helicopters. The landing zone was too small for the 160th Blackhawks, but a perfect fit for the little birds. The team would be escorted by 2 Cobra gunships. Hermione pulled down the goggles on her helmet, which was provided on request. She was taking no chances with her well-being. She wore a WWW Shield copyright shirt under her jacket and Kevlar vest again, provided upon request. Moody thought she was mad and even more paranoid than him, but Flamel could understand her thought processes. The latest reports from the front lines was that the beachhead was secured and Marines were streaming in and headed towards the battle. Atlantis wizards and members of Second Wizard were apparating in on Black Beach and moving in marine lavs towards their objectives. Some were going to try to get into the elixir repository in the northwest part of the island, while the others were going to storm the old Roman fort. The platoon of Arvs and the first and second platoons of Alpha Company were pinned down near Phase Line Scrimgeour, where the forest transitioned to mountain on the western side of the island. They took off with the cobras on either side of them. As they flew, Hermione's curiosity got the better of her and she looked down. The world raced by below her. The Vicksburg flashed past, the crew on her deck looking like ants. As they flew over the beach, she saw vast amounts of equipment and marines and members of Second Wizard moving towards the fight. They flew towards the western mountain. Moody looked at her and pantomimed to cast Revillo Hominum. After a few minutes of hand signals and lip-reading, she got the idea and cast the spell. There was a glowing spot near a cluster of bushes halfway to the summit. The sniper was under an invisibility cloak. Moody summoned it to him, and one of the cobras let loose a stream of 20 rounds. The sniper was no more. The group proceeded to the LZ, an open field before the valley itself, separated from the valley by a stand of trees. The two MH6s flared and landed in the field, the cobras providing overwatch. They moved quickly off the benches and moved towards the trees, the seals with their weapons at the ready. The little birds didn't waste time leaving the area. They made it to the trees and began scouting the valley below. One seal looked through a spotting scope. "Hey, Minister, there's some activity down there, about 1,000 yards downrange. There's one bad guy, looks like he's drawing something in the ground, and the rest, about 20, are looking around." He reached for his radio earpiece. "That airstrike on the ridge killed about 500 bad guys. Drone footage shows they were all bunched up ready to charge. The other 1,000 are unaccounted for, they just disappeared. Damn, that means they could pop up behind us for all we know. Can I look through that thing?" "Sure, Minister." Flame will look through the scope. "Well, that's Rasputin. I can't make out the others, but, oh, wait. Somebody just popped in. Yep, that's Zygonov. Handing him something, bloody hell, it's the Elder Wand." Chapter 487, Bubble Bobble. 1030 Z Tuesday, December 31, 1996 Marsulera Catlantis DEFCON status. 349% next up. Wait until gardeners get their hands on this Stanislav. Drackle looked in approval as the Death Eaters controlling the airfield began to be swarmed under. It was only a matter of time now, he thought. Not only were the Death Eaters facing a large force of wizards dotted with Muslims for humans irregulars, but there were now reports that an expeditionary force from the Iranian army was heading in their direction. The Death Eaters had given it the old college try, however. They had managed to erect a small protective dome over the airfield and find a few dragons to defend it. The dragons had proven to be both a blessing and curse. It was true that they made attacking the target extremely dangerous. However, their arrival had caused almost all of the civilian onlookers to start running for their lives, particularly after one of them nearly burned down a small apartment building in an attempt to get at one of Drackle's men. There would be very few civilian casualties as a result. It was fairly obvious that the end was nigh for the Death Eater movement, hopefully this time for good. They were outnumbered at least 6-1, at least in this particular location. Drackle had watched in admiration, and even a little shock, as the dome surrounding the airfield collapsed under a barrage of laser-guided bombs. Ideally, the attackers would have used Tomahawk missiles, but with all of the civilian buildings in the area, precision and human judgment were going to be much more important. Many of the Muslims for human soldiers had suddenly discovered that they really wanted to be somewhere else once the dragons had shown up. Fortunately, some of them, including Anton's successor, had mustered the courage to attack one of the dragons with a machine gun. The bullets had actually managed to tear through the creature's fragile wings and forced it to the ground. The only problem was that the dragon hadn't taken the loss of its wings philosophically, choosing to breathe fire on its tormentors instead. A good half of the Muslims for Humans recruits had been caught in that raid, and the wizards were barely able to cast a spell in time to protect their new allies. Some of the Muslims for Humans men grumbled about the spell, but they didn't complain that much, considering the alternative was to have been turned into charcoal. Drackle watched as one of the special forces men near him aimed a bazooka at the last remaining dragon. The round hit the monster in the head, destroying it in a colossal explosion. Bits of blood and gore sprayed everywhere as the dragon's carcass crashed onto the airfield's runway. He glanced at the Death Eaters and saw that they were all looking at the dragon and standing very still. Drackle could already sense the gears churning in their heads. Should we surrender or die? The decision didn't take long. Seconds later, the Death Eaters took off their masks, pocketed their wands, and raised their hands to the sky. Drackle thought he saw his Atlantis bubble flicker a little as he ordered the rest of his men to cease fire. It was nothing, he thought. Some rogue Death Eater probably launched a spell, and I saw the beam's reflection in the bubble. It's not like it could have been anything else. However, the incident forced him to focus on the fact that this could be a trap. He would have to proceed very carefully here. The simple fact that they still had their wands in their pockets made him nervous. Gathering a small group of wizards and muggles, he led the delegation over to the remains of the Death Eater encampment to take the enemy's surrender. At first, everything was peaceful. The Death Eaters came up to him, surrendered their wands, and did not fight as his comrades placed them in handcuffs or magical binders, depending on the background of the arresting officer. As he worked, reports began coming in from places like Basra, where the Death Eaters were also starting to surrender. Drackle was about to take the wand of the next prisoner when something which he thought was impossible happened. His Atlantis bubble flickered once more and vanished. Suddenly, he was unprotected with a Death Eater 2 feet from him. He heard a grunt of surprise next to him and caught a glimpse of the man next to him also without his Atlantis bubble. This could be a problem. Atlantis. Endukaku hurried over to Dagher with an expression of alarm on his face. Grand Mugwump, we've got a bit of a problem here for our friends in Buyin and Iraq. Dagher frowned. A problem? From what I've been hearing, things have been going pretty well. The Death Eaters are being rounded up in Iraq, and the coalition forces have just breached the shield wall on Buyin. Endukaku grinned slightly. That, sir, is part of the problem. We may be in a situation which could endanger our forces. Dagger stared at him. What? Explain. Endukaku stared at the floor, a little embarrassed. Well, I just had them recalculate the apocalypsometer reading now that the Death Eaters are about to be eliminated from Iraq. It's dropped, as you would expect. It's now at about 4.93%. Dagger was confused. It's dropped 0.4%. That's pretty good and not unexpected. What's the problem? Endukaku looked back at the Grand Mugwump. Well, we've just downgraded to DEFCON 3, sir. We're no longer above the 5% barrier, which in turn means we should stop intervening in Buyin and Iraq. Dagher snorted. We're already there. It's not like we can extricate ourselves easily. You have my permission to proceed. Endukaku nodded distractedly. I was expecting you would say that. However, there's even a bigger issue. Once we hit DEFCON 3, the Atlantis bubbles go down all over the world, including Buyin. Dagger's eyes widened when he realized what that meant. Oh shit, I should have thought about that. Damn me. Endukaku tried to calm his boss. You've done a pretty good job so far, even though you're relatively new to Atlantis. Not good enough. Can you turn those rings back on? Endukaku shook his head. They're tied to the 5% boundary, and we can't control that. All we can do wait until it exceeds 5% again and not recalculate the DEFCON value until the battles end or things get bad enough that we get out of the phase transition on the DEFCON 2 side. Phase transition? What do you mean? Endukaku explained. Suppose we're exactly at 5% and we make progress in a way which relies on the bubbles. The value will drop below 5%, at which point the bubbles would have shut off. However, since losing the bubbles will allow the enemy to advance, the value will start rising towards 5% again, bringing us back where we started. Dagger began to see where this is going. I get it. And if we breach the 5% barrier going up, the shields will come back up, which will reduce the enemy's progress. That will cause it to go back down to 5% again. Correct. It's a phase transition, just like when we're at 0 Celsius and are converting from water to ice and vice versa. There's a long period of time when trying to heat the water-ice mixture doesn't change the temperature. Marcel, the Death Eater, and Drackle spent a good second or so staring at where the Atlantis bubble had been. Then all hell broke loose. The Death Eater had been handing the wand hilt first to Drackle. The prisoner suddenly reached for the wand with his other hand, clearly intending to turn it around. Drackle was only vaguely aware of that as he brought his own wand into his hand. He didn't know why the shield was down, but he had to defend himself now. He cast Expelliarmus just as the Death Eater opened his mouth to cast something which would have likely made life unpleasant for him. The Death Eater's wand flew away, where it was picked up by one of the auras in the first division. Drackle then hit his Death Eater with a stunning spell, which kept him docile long enough to put him in binders. A quick glance down the line revealed that several other Death Eaters had tried to attack the Atlanteans when the shields had dropped. 2 of the Atlanteans had actually been caught off guard and succumbed. However, it hadn't taken long before their backups subdued their attackers. Drackle shuddered to think about what would happen if the bubbles went down on Booyan as well. He had about 5 seconds to ponder this when gunfire broke out a few blocks away, far from the front. Was he imagining something, or were the Muggles fighting each other now? Then it occurred to him. Saddam Hussein was dead, and the Iraqi government was in disarray. The Death Eaters had been rounded up, leaving a power vacuum for the Muggles. The door was open for the Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds to bid for control of the nation. To make matters worse, troops from Iran and Saudi Arabia were converging on Baghdad to oust a dark wizard government which no longer existed. Only time would tell if they would actually leave Iraq. ROU. SS Nasser Booyan, Nicholas Flamel may have already been on Booyan. However, his patroness was already on the ship, and the glowing phoenix turned as a wizard flew in and landed on the deck. The man's face was bloody, and he had a scar on a cheek. He and the rest of Tay Advisory Council listened as the man began his report. Gentlemen, we've got a bit of a problem. Shortly after we destroyed the shield, all the Atlantis bubbles turned off, catching everyone off guard. A good 40 people were taken out, while our side was trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Progress appears to have stopped for now. Igor Karkaroff blinked at the messenger. How could the Atlantis bubbles just turn off like that? They're not supposed to do that. The messenger shrugged. I don't know, sir. They just disappeared, and they haven't come back since. Flamel didn't like this. Could Rasputin have done something? One of the Atlanteans shook his head. I don't think so. Those rings are controlled from the prophecy department on Atlantis. I sure as hell hope Atlantis hasn't been compromised. Flamel didn't want to bring this up, but he had to. Diversion. Could this whole thing with Booyan and Iraq be a diversion? The Atlantean frowned. It's possible, but I doubt it. That vampire we interrogated didn't mention anything about an Atlantis takeover. However, it's a good thing to check. I'll see if I can send a message over there to ask for clarification. He issued the appropriate orders and turned back to the messenger. Do you have an update on the Elder Wand? The messenger looked at his feet. They're still fierce, fighting over it. We actually had it inside an Atlantis bubble for a while, something which I thought would keep it ours for good. That had been, of course, until the damn bubbles went down. The Habsburg princess, who had been holding it, was blown away by a sniper before she could bring out her wand. Karkaroff blinked. We're getting nobles killed. Looks like it. Sir Igor Romanov is also down. He was killed shortly after using the Elder Wand to remove the shield. He had to bring down his bubble so he could disarm the wand's prior owner. We've got to get the nobles out of here until we can at least get those bubbles back. Most of them are just being invited just because they've got the rings. They don't have much practical fighting experience. The Atlantean nodded. I agree. Tell them to retreat and leave the fighting to the professionals. Any news on that potion the Black Guard cultists are carrying around? I remember you saying Slughorn didn't recognize it. Don't know. Sir Slughorn claims it's some kind of healing potion, and the few of us who have quaffed it say it has amazing healing powers. It once saved someone from the brink of death. If it's a healing potion, it's the strongest one I've ever encountered. Flamel frowned and began scanning the carnage around him. Maybe I can identify it. I've been around longer than you have, and I've seen lots of strange stuff. There's a headless black cultist here with a vial. It's a glowing. God, no, it can't be. Karkaroff didn't like this. Can't be what? Flamel unstoppered the vial and took a whiff. A horrified expression appeared on his face as he drank a few drops. Shaking his head in disbelief and pocketing the vial, he answered quickly. Bloody hell, that's the elixir of life. They've got themselves a philosopher's stone. Everyone started talking at once until the Atlantean suddenly amplified his voice and shouted, How is this possible? Flamel looked towards the old Roman fort. They have Hugh hostage, and he knows how to make the stone, or at least once did. I bet they tortured or legilimented him. He wouldn't have given out that information willingly. I don't know where he'd have gotten the spell components from, though. They're pretty obscure. He turned to the messenger. Tell everyone to start looking for the stone as well. If they find, have them confiscate it immediately and return it to me so I can destroy it. It would be a small red gem, probably under heavy guard. Also, try to steal as many of those elixir vials as you can. We don't want those in the hands of our enemy. There was a brief moment of silence. Suddenly, the Atlantean chuckled. Well, at least we now know how Rasputin is planning to revive Karshe. Flamel stared helplessly into the heavens. First the Elder Wand, and now the Philosopher's Stone. If those get into Karshe's hands, we're in deep, deep trouble. Chapter 488. Lav Beats Bubble. 1113 Z Tuesday, December 31, 1996 Marsular Atlantis DEFCON status. 257% next up. A civilian reacts Stanislav Drakel had thought that his work would have been done as soon as the last group of Death Eaters had been rounded up. Unfortunately, there had been a major fly in the ointment, one which had nothing whatsoever to do with the Death Eaters. Right now, he and 6 other members of the 1st Division of the Wizarding Standing Army found themselves in the unenviable position of trying to separate 2 rioting groups of Iraqi Muggles who were fighting for control of the city center. One bunch consisted entirely of Sunni Muslims, and the rest consisted entirely of Shiites. Both sides were armed with handguns and a few grenades here and there. Drakel's fears had come true. Although the Death Eaters were gone, it soon became obvious to everyone that a new government needed to be installed in Iraq, and there were at least 5 or 6 different parties who wanted to be in charge. It was true that several of the old administration's people had survived thanks to his raid on the Death Eater safe house. Unfortunately, the decrees of a small group of politicians wouldn't do much good when the other people had guns. The police force was hopelessly overwhelmed by the sheer number of insurgents, which had put the government in a situation that they would have called in the army to clean everything up. Except that the army had its hands full. Dagher, as a former Saudi minister, had enough influence on the Saudi command structure to convince the government to call back the Saudi troops which had been headed into Iran now that the Death Eaters had been ousted. On the other hand, most of the Iraqi army veterans knew what had happened between 1980 and 1988 when it came to the Iranian army. It soon became obvious that the invasion to remove the Death Eaters had served as the perfect pretext for restarting the Iran-Iraq War. Iran had been on the offensive when the war had ended in 1988, and they soon found themselves with troops in Iraq and no obvious Death Eaters to attack. Several commanders figured, might as well try to go after Iraq again now that their government is in shambles and we've already got troops there. To make matter worse, the Kurds were starting to get restless up north. There had been a few incidents where Kurdish soldiers had fired on Iraqi and or Iranian forces. For the time being, the Kurdish leaders had managed to keep everything under control. Drackle was unsure, however, as to how long it would remain that way. Gunfire brought Drackle back to reality, and he immediately ordered the men around him to cast Expelliarmus on both sides while he covered the wizards with his Atlantis bubble. The bubbles were now on again, and as far as he could tell they were on for good. He had received a bulletin from Dagher explaining the temporary fall of the bubbles, and he was hoping that the fact that the bubbles were on again was due to the increasing chaos in Iraq, and not because of something going on somewhere on Bouillon. The reason was simple. Iran and Iraq going after each other was one thing, but a wizard who liked to throw around biological weapons was something else entirely. After confirming that both groups of civilians had been completely disarmed, he removed his bubble and amplified his voice. Attention, citizens of Iraq. I am Stanislav Drackle of the 1st Division of the Wizarding Standing Army. Your country is in tough enough shape as is, and you don't need revolutions stirring things up further. One of the rioters sneered at him. And what are you going to do about it? We've been oppressed for a while, and now it's time for us to take control with a new government. Dagher glared at the speaker. And what makes you qualified to run the country? It's our turn, wizard. The previous administrations got us into war and dictatorship. I see. And do you have any experience running a country, good sir? The speaker hesitated, then said, I must admit I haven't run a country before. However, I know what should not be done, and I know to not make those mistakes. I assume treating everyone equally and fairly is something which must be done by a just government, right? Drackle slammed the point home. Then why are you attacking these people because they're from a different ethnic group? That makes you unjust and unqualified, in my opinion. What we need is government by a neutral party, like what we had in the Koreas. One of the rioters' opponents cut in. And who's going to run that? The United Nations? Atlantis? Hell, you. If it is one of you wizards, what makes you qualified to do it? Drackle responded smoothly. Because we have experience doing so in Korea, and because we aren't troubled by Muggle vendettas and prejudices like you characters are. In fact, it is my fervent wish that the Saudis and my forces stay in this area to keep everything under control until the United Nations or some other authority can create a temporary government. The first man shook his head. We're not Koreans. You don't know Iraqis at all, don't you? No, however, we know human nature. And we did pretty well in Korea, even though we didn't know the Koreans very well. Trust me, son, this will work. Do you want anyone else to die? Of course not. That's why we need to create a new government with us at the head. Drackle tried to negotiate with the two parties for a little longer, but it soon became obvious that they weren't getting it. He told his men to prepare for another peacekeeping mission, this time in the Middle East. Against his better judgment, he began hexing people from both sides and told them that they would keep on getting hexed as long as they continued to fight each other. That eventually worried them enough to get them to back off. Thank God for those Expelliarmuses early on in the encounter. He had scarcely escorted the two sides out of contact with each other when he saw a Patronus fly in from Atlantis and land right in front of him. He recognized the Scorpion easily. It was Dagher's. The Scorpion spoke. Good morning, Stanislav. How are things going? Drackle bit back a curse. Problematic. It looks like this whole region is going to explode. It's obvious that you're going to send us on a mission to stabilize Iraq, sir, and I've already told my men to get ready. The scorpion shook its head. That won't be necessary, Stanislav. You're going on a mission, but it's not going to be in Iraq. Now that the Death Eaters are out of the way, I'm going to be sending you and the rest of the 1st Division to Buyin. I want you to apparate over to the American warship Nassau in 15 minutes so we can debrief you on what is going on. Drackle was aghast. Sir, he said, are you sure that's wise? The Middle East is going to completely self-destruct unless we keep things under control. You won't be going there permanently, Stanislav. Once we have Buyin well in hand and Kashi back in Sheol where he belongs or dead, then you will be able to spend as much time as you want in Iraq. Drackle gritted his teeth. You've already got men there, sir. We're needed here. The scorpion shook its head. It's true that help is needed where you are. However, you have to understand that this is right now a Muggle-only fight. Let the Muggle authorities take care of that. It is not up to us to determine who rules Iraq. And keep in mind that, although wizards can deal with Muggles, Muggles can't deal with wizards easily. The simple truth is this. While it is true that wizards can clean up Iraq, that would leave Muggles to deal with Rasputin and Kashi, which they cannot do. Drackle felt his fighting a losing battle, but he had to try. Sir, I just separated 2 gangs of rioters who would have killed each other. Can't we stay a little longer? I'm afraid not, Stanislav. The battle for Buyin has been extremely bloody, with hundreds of wizards killed on both sides and Rasputin still at large. We're going to need reinforcements, and you're the reinforcements. Sir, I respectfully request. Dagger cut him off. Request denied. We'll be expecting you on the boat in 15 minutes. Dagger out. The Patronus disappeared, and Drackle glared for a good 5 seconds at where it had been. However, orders were orders. Sighing, he shouted to his men, Attention, we've been redeployed to Buyin. Prepare to apparate over to the Nassau in 15 minutes. His second frowned. Sir, is that wise? This whole country will likely blow up if we aren't here to defend it. Probably. However, if we finish off Kashi fast enough, maybe we'll be able to win both of these fights. Now move. 1135 Zebuyan. Atlantis Aura Johann Stein turned his head just in time to see the Elder Wand fly into the hands of the wizard next to him. He didn't know English all that well, and he doubted that the man next to him knew German. However, if all else failed, there was always Latin. He took off his ring momentarily. Thank God it had come back on and reached out. Surrender the wand. Hurry. The Elder Wand's new owner nodded and let Stein disarm him. The Elder Wand flew into Stein's hand, and he slammed the ring back onto his finger just as machine gun fire tore into the wand's prior owner. The man's body collapsed in a pool of blood as the trail of bullets flowed in his direction. They got him, but too late. Soon, they were bouncing off the Atlantis bubble and falling harmlessly to the ground. Stein punched the air in excitement and turned to one of the other soldiers. Ernst, send a message to Dagher and tell him that I'm the master of the Elder Wand and that I've got it in an Atlantis bubble. Ernst saluted and ran off as an odd mechanical sound caught Stein's ear. Frowning, he turned and saw that the sound was coming from what appeared to be an lav, one of those magical resistant vehicles the Muggles had used to storm the island. It must have recently seen action, as its machine gun was steaming. Ernst shouted that he was going to take the lav back to base. Stein nodded and watched as he climbed into the back of the vehicle to spread the good news. Zhukov waited for the enemy soldier to make it into the vehicle before jumping him, closing the door and grabbing his gun. Thinking that firing the weapon would alert the Elder Wand's new owner as to what they were doing, Zhukov conked poor Ernst on the head with the butt of the weapon. He'd probably be out for a long time. A quick look at the man's uniform revealed that Zhukov wouldn't be able to fit in his clothes. Oh well. He headed over to the driver's section and spoke in Karmav's ear. I've taken our intruder out of the picture. You think you can get that wand out of the bubble? Karmav smiled. I think so. This vehicle has a field which converts magic to electricity, right? And the Atlantis bubble is made out of magic, is it not? Stein frowned as the lav approached him. What was going on here? Why didn't Ernst tell the driver to go back to base and report the capture of the Elder Wand? He approached the vehicle and started waving for the driver to return to base. The lav just trundled on in his direction. Slightly disturbed, he braced the Atlantis bubble against a tree and prepared to block the vehicle's path. This was important. What on earth was Ernst doing? The vehicle made its way up to the Atlantis bubble and promptly passed right through it in a shower of electric sparks. Stein stared at it for a moment, and it took him a moment to realize that the anti-magic field was likely disrupting the magic of the Atlantis bubble. He made a mental note to warn his commanding officer about this effect. He cupped his hands over his mouth and began screaming at the driver. "Go back to base. The Elder Wand needs to be taken out of the fight." The lav didn't move for a moment. Then the machine gun slowly began to turn in his direction. Realizing what had happened, he pointed his wand at the lav and instinctively cast a spell. Nothing emerged from the wand other than a mild electric shock. Wonderful, he thought. I should have used a defensive spell like Protego rather than the offensive Stupefy. Damn DEFCON 2 rules of engagement. Meanwhile, the lav's new owners trained their machine gun on him and set loose on him under full automatic. That weapon worked inside the lav. Karmov lowered the gun and began whooping it up. "Check it out. I'm probably the master of the Elder Wand now." Zhukov didn't take his eyes off the displays. "Good for you. Now let's get the wand if possible and get out of here." Chapter 489, Torpedoing a Myth. 1136 Z Tuesday, December 31, 1,996,169, South Street Waltham, United States of America. Atlantis DEFCON status. 258% next up. Mad I I knew that New Year's Day was a holiday. However, most of the festivities were on New Year's Eve. Why didn't people get New Year's Eve off as well? It was kind of a surprise to find that we had to work on the 31st. On the other hand, this was my first full-time job, which included a winter session. Perhaps other companies were not like Parametric. On the other hand, who was I to complain? I still had a job, and that was the important thing. Many of my friends from MIT and Brandeis, including those in the high-demand software engineering field, had either lost jobs or not been able to find one. Some had taken temporary employment as waitresses, janitors, Christmas elves, the fake kind, and so forth. My parents urged me to work my rear end off because I did not want to join that throng, particularly with my poor social skills. I turned on the television for the morning news and saw that a wizard's hat was displayed on the television monitor behind the anchor desk. Clearly, the fighting in Iraq was still going on. How high would gas prices climb today? $4.25 per gallon. I felt damn lucky I could walk to work if I so chose. There was no way I was going to move to Cambridge or Brookline and deal with gas prices like that for my commute. The announcer was in the middle of his report. Right, the last Death Eaters have been ousted from Iraq, and the land of Saddam Hussein is once again free from wizard tyranny. Unfortunately, we're not out of the woods yet. Although the Death Eaters are gone, the Iraqi nation has suddenly found itself with foreign troops on its soil and a non-functional government. Multiple sources are reporting that no fewer than 4 factions in Iraq are vying for power, and that the nation is about to devolve to civil war. Shiite Muslims are fighting Sunni, a few army commanders want to turn the country into a military dictatorship, and several Kurd partisans are taking action in the north. However, that is not the only story. Let's contact Rebecca Walsh, who is coming to us from just outside the city of Mosul. An attractive young woman, in order to be a good reporter, looks tended to be helpful, appeared on the screen the middle of what seemed to be a clearing. She appeared to be in a desert somewhere, and I couldn't identify any landmarks. Without warning, there was a puff of black smoke in the distance. A few seconds later, a faint boom reached the microphone. The explosion must have been pretty loud to have been heard from the reporter's location. The woman on the scene began to report. This is Rebecca Walsh from just outside Mosul, where the engagement between the Iraqi and Iranian Muggle forces is continuing to escalate. There are mortars shelling Iraqi soldiers just over the horizon here, and there has been a steady stream of refugees reporting of major warfare between the Iraqi and Iranian armies. The anchorman asked, why would the Iraqis be fighting the Iranians? They believe the Iranians are planning to take advantage of their army's position inside Iraq and resume the Iran-Iraq War from 1980-1988. Officially, the Iranians say they are there to ensure that their Iraqi neighbor doesn't fall into civil war. No one here believes that, though. There's no peaceful reason for the Iranians to be advancing anymore now that word has gone out that the last pockets of Death Eaters have been eradicated. Besides, if the Iranians intended to help the Iraqis, why are they shelling Iraqi positions? Another thing to keep in mind is that Iraq just took some land from the Iranians as a reward for Saddam's work during Judgment Day. The Iranians could very well believe that they are no longer entitled to that land because they let dark wizards similar to Voldemort take over their country. This could also be a land grab. This doesn't sound good. What are the Saudis doing, and why aren't the wizarding forces maintaining the peace? From what we've been told, Wizard Drakel's division is currently in Iraq, and they did a fine job in the careers. The reporter's face darkened slightly. The Saudis have reportedly ceased their invasion of Iraq and are heading back to the border, where they're maintaining a defensive position until all of this plays out. That's what one would have expected Iran to do as well, if you think about it. As far as Drakel's unit goes, it was supposedly here half an hour ago, and then promptly disappeared all over the country. Where did they go? They didn't say, but people have been speculating. If the reports coming out of the Black Sea are to be believed, there is a major wizarding operation going on there. Experts suspect that the wizards left to join that operation. They figure the UN and the neighboring states can deal with what is, at this point, an all-Muggle crisis. I blinked. Another major wizarding operation. Was there another group of Death Eaters which the world hadn't known about and who were now seeking to avenge the death of their leader? Just what the world needed at this point, I thought. The anchorman clued her in. Rebecca, we have more information on that operation in the Black Sea. It appears that a large force of wizards and muggles from all over the world is trying to suppress an uprising by a Russian cult worshipping the god Chernobog. At least that's what Atlantis is saying. However, there are rumors that it's gone beyond that. Supposedly the purpose of this cult is to restore a legendary Russian dark wizard to power. They're concerned that he will try to take over the Muggle world now that the statute of secrecy has fallen. The reporter frowned. Sounds like a good description of Voldemort, but I didn't know Voldemort was Russian. Voldemort wasn't Russian, he was British. This Russian seems to be a completely different individual, but Atlantis is taking him as seriously as they did Voldemort. How much do you know about him? Only what we're hearing out of CNN. Just that he is considered a major threat to the area and that they are focusing on a location known as Bouillon. They have been reassuring us that he is unlikely to return to power, and this is all being done as a precaution. The reporter's frown deepened. I've never heard of Bouillon. Neither have I, supposedly. It's another hidden island like Círdan, and no one seems to know where it is other than the people involved in the operation itself. Now, Rebecca, can you hold for a moment? We've got a new bulletin coming out of Iraq. The reporter's response was drowned out as a tank suddenly rumbled past her. It had Arabic symbols on it which I couldn't read, so I couldn't tell whose side it was on. However, it was clearly heading in the direction of that smoke plume. Rebecca's image vanished and was replaced by that of the anchorman by himself. Ladies and gentlemen, we have more disturbing news out of the Middle East. There is a report, at this point unconfirmed, that an American oil tanker has struck a mine in the Straits of Hormuz and is sinking. No one has claimed responsibility for this attack, and at this point, it would be premature to link this incident to the fighting between Iran and Iraq. Mines in the Straits of Hormuz indicate a disturbing escalation of the conflict. This is because all Middle Eastern oil exported to the Western world has to travel through the straits. If the straits are blocked off, the American people loses access to all Middle Eastern oil. For those of you who remember the 1970s oil embargo, be prepared. We may have to go through that all over again. I had been a child at the time, and I remembered very little of the embargo. I vaguely recalled something about us not wanting to turn lights on Shabbat as often, not just because it was traditionally forbidden, but because of an embargo of some sort. However, if something had been serious enough to worry my father, it must have been problematic indeed. I turned the television off. The world was scary enough as it is, particularly now that it knew what damage a dark wizard could do. It was probably time for me to get dressed and go to work. Krivac Class FFG Ladney, 247th Independent Submarine Division under the Black Sea. Captain Konstantin Sokolov looked at the message from HQ, and his eyes widened. Swearing viciously, he raced back to the bridge and started shouting out orders. Attention, all hands. We have been given new orders. We are to head to the island of Buyan to help destroy a group of wizards. Set course for the following coordinates, where we will rendezvous with the American warship Nassau. And have all crew members look at the following webpage from the London Daily Mail. There was a long pause. Finally, the Zoe drew a deep breath. Captain, this has got to be a joke. There's no island of Buyan, that's a myth, and... Sokolov looked grimly at him. This isn't a joke, I'm afraid. Get us over there as fast as possible. Cavitate if you have to, and yes, that's an order. Make sure all torpedoes are ready for use. The Zoe blanched, but orders were orders. Yes, Sir Helmsman, enter the new course into the system and let's get going. Engineering, check the torpedoes. The helmsman nodded and began entering the information into the computer. Yes, sir. The Zoe looked at the captain in disbelief. Captain, what's going on? Are we really going to be attacking wizards? Sokolov nodded. Indeed, we are. And apparently there is an island of Buyan, like the myths say. I don't know where it is, but I get the impression the people on the Nassau do know. This is a joint American-Russian operation which involves both wizards and Muggles, and supposedly both Moscow and the Americans are nervous about this. If you want any provocation for our side, there are rumors that these wizards have killed Igor Romanov, a member of the wizarding nobility. Tsar Alexei is furious, and he's gotten Yeltsin all riled up as well. The Zoe frowned. We're sending a sub over there because someone messing around with the wizarding Romanovs. Who the hell's running the operations there? Grigory Rasputin. Sokolov chuckled. Judging by all of these crazy surprises we've had over the past year, I wouldn't be surprised. The helmsman gulped and turned to the captain. Sir, if Buyan really exists, is the rest of the story true as well? I mean, about Koschei the Deathless. The smile melted off Sokolov's face. I sure as hell hope not. From what I recall, he was one nasty piece of work. However, even if he does exist and is still alive after all these years, I doubt his magic will stop a torpedo aimed at his balls. Chapter 490. Mad I Bye-Bye. 1241 Zebian Atlantis DEFCON status. 258% next up. Free trip to us far away from the center of the action. Hermione, Flamel, Moody, and their band of special agents made their way across the northwestern portion of the island. They had spent the last hour or so scouring Buyan for Koschei's reputed Horcrux. Unfortunately, they were not picking up any conclusive traces of objects mentioned in the Koschei legend. Hair bones, dead oak trees, egg shards, and so forth. Flamel hoped that Koschei hadn't gotten creative and simply dropped the needle on the ground without anything to identify it. Finding a needle in a haystack would be nothing compared to finding a needle in a forest full of pine trees. They had avoided Black Fist patrols for the most part, because Moody was able to see through the trees with his magical eye and catch sight of enemy troops before they could see Flamel's band. This allowed Flamel and friends to get out of sight, or at least under camouflage, before the Rasputinites got close. Although Flamel was fairly certain that they would be able to fend off any intruders, he didn't want Rasputin finding out what they were trying to do. If he realized that they were after Kashay's Horcrux, he would probably become very irritated and send virtually every single minion on the island after them. The only thing which looked remotely suspicious to this point was a large concentration of defensive spells focused on the top of the western peak. These spells had been there ever since Flamel had first investigated the island under Grand Mugwump Chen 5 centuries earlier. Chen, not surprisingly, had forced his way through to the center of the complex and done extensive digging in the area. He had found nothing, however. The investigation had left the island with a third of the people, thinking that the Horcrux was there ready to be picked up, a third convinced that the Horcrux was there but inaccessible, and a third sure that it was a red herring designed to lure attackers away from the Horcrux's actual location. As a result, Flamel had resumed his investigation up there and had no better luck than he had centuries earlier. If anything, his luck was worse because the island was now completely overgrown with 5 centuries worth of forest. Back in the old days, there had been large, clear patches. Flamel couldn't decide whether the Horcrux was there or not. He had to continue looking, however. Operating under the assumption that they had been looking the wrong place the whole time, he turned to his map and stabbed his finger at the northwestern corner of the island. "This is our next destination, ladies and gentlemen. There's a small cave up there which we noticed the last time I was here, but did not have much of a chance to explore. It's hard to reach, and in an out-of-the-way location. It sounds like it would be a perfect place to hide a Horcrux, either Rasputin's or Kashay's." Hermione looked at the map and frowned. "You said you were here earlier. You looked through it already and didn't find anything. How do you know we're not making the same mistake twice?" Flamel sighed. "I don't know, to be honest. However, we've got a hell of a lot more people searching this time, some of whom are armed with fancy Muggle technology. Back then, we only had 5 or 6 people. Now we have several dozen." Moody pointed at his artificial eye. "Don't forget this, Minister. If it's invisible, I'll pick it up." Flamel nodded. "Exactly. Now everyone be careful unless I'm mistaken. It's less than half a mile from here. Don't make any noise unless you have to, and if you see any footprints, alert the rest of us immediately." Fighting their way through thick forest littered with trees down by the B-2 bomber attacks, they made their way closer to the cave. Soon, they saw evidence of footprints leading to and from their destination. Moody grimaced when he saw that. "Everyone, keep your wands and guns at the ready. We don't know if the Horcrux is there, but that doesn't mean that the Rasputinites aren't using it as a command center. Hermione, Minister, you two take the lead. Leave just enough of space between your Atlantis bubbles to allow me to shoot between them, and keep it quiet." They made their way over the last ridge and caught sight of a black speck in the distance. Flamel was about to press forward when Moody suddenly hissed and pointed at the cave. "Look out, it's guarded. There are no fewer than 4 people there, 2 wizards and 2 muggles." Hermione thought for a moment. Interesting coincidence, a possible Horcrux location with guards around it, and it's in the middle of nowhere. Of course, it could just be an enemy base. Flamel nodded. "Indeed, Hermione. I personally am not looking forward to infiltrating an enemy base, particularly one with only one entrance. However, remember our mission. We're here to take out Horcruxes, and it's possible Kashay's Horcrux is in there. We have to try it, we have no choice. Besides, it's quite possible that the cave is guarded, because there's a Horcrux there, which isn't Kashay's." Moody grinned evilly. "Rasputin's. We never did figure out what happened to it." "Exactly. From what I've been told, it's an old music box. If you see anything from the Cache myth or a music box, call for Hermione. She's got the sword, and the sword is the only safe means of destroying Horcruxes. At that point, everyone is to focus on giving Hermione the chance of knocking out the Horcrux. Understood. Everyone nodded, and Flamel continued. Unless you see evidence of the Horcrux, do not get into a fight. If necessary, imperious the guards into thinking they haven't seen anything. Like I told you earlier, we don't want Rasputin finding out we're out here. The rest of the group agreed, and Flamel told everyone to slowly move ahead. They crept through the snowy forest, barely making a sound. Their stealth lasted approximately 5 minutes when a caterwauling charm went off directly over their heads. Moody pulled out his wand as the guards now in plain sight reached for their weapons. Everybody, get down until I deal with the wizards. Hermione, Minister, you know what to do. Flamel kept his wand in his pocket. He couldn't use it in the bubble anyway. To his left, Hermione stood stock still in her bubble. She was trembling visibly, and it occurred to her that this was the first time she had ever seen real combat. She was acting like a Gryffindor, however, and toughing it out, just as someone from her house should. Multicolored bolts flashed through the forest and spent most of their time hitting trees. 5 minutes later, all that had managed to do was point out the marauders' location to the enemy. Gunfire suddenly erupted from behind them, and the seals in the back suddenly found themselves returning fire. Hermione turned to Flamel and had to scream to be heard over the din of the spellcasters. There's got to be something they're all right. Look at all those people defending it. I wouldn't be surprised if it is the Horcrux. Flamel slowly nodded. Neither would I at this point. This is very interesting. Should we call in a missile strike? Flamel shook his head. Don't bother. All that will do is bury it in rubble. We're going to need to get over there and... Flamel's comment was cut off by a shriek of pain between him and Hermione. Both bubble bearers turned to see Moody writhing on the ground, a bullet through his wand hand. Swearing loudly, the aura tore off a piece of his robe and screamed for one of the men to help him make a tourniquet. Once the tourniquet was in place, a white-faced Moody turned to Flamel. Damn, the bastard got in a lucky shot through the hole. That makes me mad, and no one wants to see me mad. Hermione tried to keep Moody down. Professor, stay down. Moody put his wand in his other hand and shoved Hermione's bubble out of the way so he could stick his left hand through opening. Roaring like a lion, he cast a hideously complex spell. A fraction of a second later, the entire clearing outside the cave caught fire. The 4 guards suddenly shrieked in pain and fell to the ground. Within seconds, they were all dead. No guards replaced them from further back in the cave. Everyone looked at Moody, who stared in satisfaction at the burned remains at the front of the cave. Seconds later, he collapsed to the ground once more. Pointing the wand at himself, he cast a healing spell. He couldn't concentrate well on it given his pain, but he did manage to prevent himself from going into shock. Meanwhile, the battle around the perimeter of the Marauders' army soon petered out as the tenacity, bravery, and skill of the SEALs took out all of the attacking units. Flamel reached for his ring. Professor Moody, I need to heal you. You can't go on this way. Moody waved him off irritably. Don't endanger yourself, Minister. Besides, I'm an aura. I've been through worse. Imagine Evan Rosier hitting me in the eye. Hermione whimpered. I hate to think. Moody glanced at Flamel's belt. Minister, if you insist, you can give me that elixir. Flamel nearly exploded. No, no one uses the elixir anymore. Hermione turned to Flamel. Dr. Flamel, he's badly injured. Flamel shook his head violently. Absolutely not. Moody spoke over her. Stop arguing. Let's get to the cave and search it before Rasputin figures out we're here. They encountered no more resistance, and soon the raiders found themselves outside the entrance to the cave. The entrance was dark, but there seemed to be an odd white glow emanating from inside. Flamel looked at the cave suspiciously. Suddenly, without warning, He removed his ring and took a whiff of the air. Hermione noticed the smell as well. Is it just me, or does something smell very sweet around here? Flamel suddenly started racing towards the cave. Shit, I know exactly what's going on now. That glow is the glow of the elixir of life. They've got the philosopher's stone in the cave. The smell clinches it. One of the seals gaped at him. Are you sure about that? Flamel didn't stop running. I'm positive. I invented it. I know the... Flamel's charge suddenly stopped short as he ran into what appeared to be an invisible wall at the mouth of the cave. He fell to the ground, rubbing his head, as Hermione barely avoided plastering herself against the barrier. Moody cast finite incantatum as the seal told him to lie down. The barrier shimmered a little, but it held. Furious, Moody raced up next to it and walked right through it. Moody, Flamel, and Hermione stared at each other. Suddenly, Hermione hit on an idea. Remember Voldemort's defense at his Horcrux cave. You can only pass through if you're injured. This would be a perfect thing to apply here to prevent people from using the elixir until they absolutely needed it. Flamel smiled. You know what? I think you're right. Alistair, check it out and come back here. If you see anyone, take them out. Hermione rounded on Flamel. Dr. Flamel, he's... Moody growled. Injured, I know. However, I'm an aura. I do things like this all the time. Now shut up and let me explore. Moody stayed in the cave for about 5 minutes. Suddenly, a swear emanated from the cave, followed by a sigh. That didn't sound good, thought Flamel. Don't tell me someone was waiting inside there and finished Moody off. 2 more minutes went by. Finally, Moody emerged from the cave. He was a changed man. Moody now had 2 natural eyes and legs, and the hideous battle scars from his face and arm had disappeared. He seemed in perfect health and free all of the fatigue that had crept up during the campaign. Hermione stared at him. Bloody hell, how? Flamel stared at him in amazement. Then, rolling his eyes, he threw his hands up. Judging from your new appearance, I take it you found the elixir there. Moody nodded, reached into his pocket, and soon began bouncing a little white ball up and down in his hand. Indeed I did, and it works like a charm. Thank you, Minister. Flamel fumed. I don't like you using it. People should not be using the elixir. Flamel suddenly realized what the little ball he was bouncing was. Pointing a trembling finger at him, he asked, Is that? Moody lifted the ball for everyone to see, and Hermione nearly retched when she realized that it was his old eye. Yes, it's my old eye. I liked it better, for God's sake. I could see invisible objects. I guess I can say goodbye to my Mad-Eye persona. One of the seals grinned. We can always poke your eye out for you. Moody shook his head. I don't like it that much. At any rate, toss me a few hand grenades. I'll look in there for a few minutes. If I see any signs of the Horcruxes, I'll report it immediately. If not, well, I guess a hand grenade or 2 should take care of your stone. Hermione cut in. And if the stone isn't there? Moody grinned. Then we deprive them of the elixir of life, which is just as good when it comes to this battle. Chapter 491, Free Trip to Ours. 1324, Zebion Atlantis DEFCON status. 260%. Next up. Kashe Isart Grigori Rasputin was running out of time, and his men were starting to get fatigued. His forces were surrounded, and they had spent the last hour or so fighting off a seemingly endless supply of Atlanteans, seals, and so forth. Most of their supply of the elixir of life had been used to treat various wounds suffered during the encounter, and Rasputin had told everyone to not use their elixir unless they were absolutely certain they were going to die. A few feet away, in the depths of the newly grown thicket, the child form of Kashe was moaning piteously. He did not look happy, and he was throwing increasingly irritated glances at Rasputin. The mad monk had the impression that Kashe was having second thoughts about making Rasputin primary disciple. On the other hand, Kashe didn't seem surprised that there were people fighting on the island. After all, That was how he had met his match last time around. Rasputin needed a lot of help, and he needed it fast. He wanted to kick himself for leaving so many people behind to guard the elixir cave. The stone wasn't even on the island, and their WSA no reason for the invaders to go there unless they knew it was hiding the elixir. Frantic, he sent a patroness over to the cave asking anyone there to join him. He didn't get a response, however. That in itself was a bad sign. Could the invaders have actually knocked out the guards and made their way into the cave after all? To make matters worse, he could feel the temperature dropping. It was likely only a matter of time until the drizzle which had built up during the day would turn into flurries and later that night into heavier snow. He really wanted to get the battle over with before that fighting in the middle of snowstorm was going to be a pain in the neck. He spun as two huge explosions let loose in the enemy ranks. Had they brought a mortar along to perform the coup de grace? The enemy fire had stopped, and it appeared that they were going to use the mortar to give their own soldiers a break. Or were they? More explosions erupted in the distance, followed by a hail of machine gun fire. Rasputin stared in astonishment as several of the enemy attackers were mowed down, and the remaining opponents started focusing their efforts on something out of Rasputin's sight. Soon, their quarry came into vision. It appeared to be one of the machines Zygonova had called an Lav, an armored personnel carrier which had been hardened against magic. He watched as the machine gun sprayed death over the battlefield once more, dropping another rank of enemy soldiers. Thank the Black Guard. One of his men had commandeered the vehicle. Bullets and spells closed in on the vehicle only to be repelled by its anti-magic armor. Realizing this was his chance, Rasputin told everyone to counterattack and handle everyone which was not in the line of sight of the Lav. Within 10 minutes, the battle was over, and the field was littered with the bodies of members of Dumbledore's army. Rasputin's weary men cheered as the Lav made its way over to their commander. The door opened, and two men emerged. Rasputin ran over and embraced them like brothers. Zhukov, Karmov, thank the Black Guard for your timely arrival. How did you take over the vehicle? Karmov grinned. Simple, we transfigured ourselves to look like enemy soldiers and pretended we were injured. The crew picked us up and let us in, and we promptly let loose with the machine gun. Rasputin grinned. Good thinking. Thank you, my lord. Speaking of our lord, I've got a bit of a present for you. I think you may find it will come in handy, especially if you need help bringing back Karshe. Karmov reached into his pocket and showed Rasputin the Elder Wand. The mad monk pumped his fist in the air and smiled ear to ear. Well done, Karmov. Well done. I hope you don't mind if I disarm you so I can take control of the wand. Karmov grinned. Promise you'll make me second disciple. Rasputin slapped Karmov on the back. You've certainly deserved it given your success here. We owe you our lives. Congratulations. Grinning, Rasputin disarmed Karmov and retrieved the Elder Wand. He turned back to the hedge, which had grown further, and began trying to figure out how to reach Karshe without resorting to an axe. It occurred to him that Avada Kedavra would likely work on trees. He'd just have to make sure that he didn't hit Karshe. He didn't want to go through that crazy ritual with the runes again. He lifted the wand and started blowing trees out of the way. He didn't get far, however, before the caterwauling charm warning the Rasputinites of incoming missile attack went off. Seconds later, missiles started landing in the middle of the Rasputinite forces. Karmov collapsed immediately as left leg was torn off by shrapnel. He reached for his elixir, but went into shock and expired before he could get to it. Hoping that the Elder Wand would enhance his draining energy reserves, Rasputin protected a roughly 2-mile diameter area centered on himself with a dome. The missiles detonated merrily on the surface of the dome for a while, giving everyone a well-deserved break. Satisfied, he went back to hacking his way through to Karshe. Then, of course, the dome collapsed under the barrage of missiles. Rasputin dove for cover as screams erupted from his men. Hiding behind a tree, he tried to think of what to do. He didn't have the energy to bring up another dome, and he didn't want to relinquish the Elder Wand. Besides, the domes inevitably blew apart when too many missiles hit them. Finally, an idea came to him. He would take advantage of all of the loose debris and shrapnel around them. If there was a way he could get all that stuff flying around at high speed, it would likely destroy the missiles or force them to fly off target. And best of all, since the explosions would produce more debris, this kind of defense would be self-perpetuating. He wouldn't have to maintain it. Telling everyone to watch the sky, he raised the Elder Wand to the sky and began uttering words which would control the weather. The words were barely audible over the sound of the explosions. However, their effects soon became obvious as the dome was soon replaced by a rotating ring of air. At first, the winds in the ring blew slowly, 10 to 20 miles per hour. However, he amplified the spell more and the wind speeds increased, 30, 50, 80. Trees started snapping and flying around as he broke 100. He waited for a few more minutes. When he lowered the wand, his men were in the eye of a mile-high tornado covering most of the western half of the island. Angry clouds surrounded his forces, but here inside the storm everything was protected. The missiles continued to come in for a few more seconds, and one of them hit the lav dead center and blew it out of existence. However, it didn't take long before the immense winds began blowing them off course, throwing debris into their path, slicing off stabilization fins, and so forth. Zhukov looked at him in amazement. "Man, my lord, that's one hell of a storm you've got there." Rasputin nodded. "Indeed, it is. I think that will handle our enemies and give us enough time to bring back Kashay and head on over to the elixir cave to replenish our elixir supply. Speaking of bringing back Kashay, who here wants to give me his elixir vial? Don't everyone jump at once." No one responded. It was obvious they wanted Kashay back, but how long was this tornadic shield going to hold? Rasputin shrugged, turned to Karmov's fallen body, and neatly plucked the unused elixir vial out of the dead man's pocket. "Thank you again, my friend. Your sacrifice will not have been in vain." 1356 Z. Fleur de Lacroix, with her charming instincts at full power, closed in on the latest group of guards. She was lucky to have headed for Rasputin when she did. With that tornado now in place, she would have never been able to get through. Her latest quarry consisted of two men. He whistled to get their attention, and they turned to look at her. It didn't take long before that look turned to a leer, and they started hooting at her and drooling. She didn't particularly care for that sort of people, so she brought out her wand and promptly stunned both of them. A few 100 feet later, she stumbled across a man and a woman. This was going to be a bit trickier. However, she knew what to do. She called out, and both the man and the woman turned to look at her. The man immediately succumbed to the charm. The woman, however, promptly challenged her and shot a green beam at her. Fleur dove behind a tree, and it crashed into the trunk and set it ablaze. Fleur shot a weapon back at her as the woman called to her colleague for help. Fleur's beam forced the woman behind a tree of her own, leaving the man staring at her lovingly. Drawing a deep breath, Fleur shouted, "Good sir, that woman tried to kill me. Help me. Neutralize her, and I will be eternally grateful to you." The man didn't think twice before turning on his colleague and hitting her with a stun beam. The woman crumpled as the man, now clearly aroused, began walking towards her and grinning. He pointed at his nether regions. "Want to see my wand and go to bed with me?" Fleur raised hers. "Fine with me. In fact, I'll even go out of the way to help you sleep. Somnolence." Seconds later, the man was asleep, and Fleur stepped over the two prone bodies. She figured she less than a half-mile away from Rasputin at this point, and judging from the experience she was picking up, he was as good as hers. Chapter 492. The Return of Kosh. 1400 Zebian Atlantis DEFCON status. 110.7%. Next up. Conservation of incapacitated people. Grigory Rasputin took a good look around the area. Everyone was looking at him expectantly, and some of them were even holding their breaths. As far as he could tell, Hugh was still subdued, and there weren't going to be any more interruptions. A flew aircraft and choppers were trying to peek over the edge of the tornado, but the wizards who had survived to this point tended to be pretty good at shooting down aircraft. Natural selection in action, Rasputin mused. Those who don't know how to evade bullets and destroy airplanes are already dead, leaving a small group of survivors who knew how to fight. Casting one glance at Halina Zyganova's hideously mangled body, he brushed the last branches out of the way and retrieved Kashay's childlike form. Telling Kashay that everything would soon be right, he carried Kashay over to an open area and laid him down gently in the snow. Had this been a normal child, Kashay would have likely been shivering and close to death. However, this was a projection of a soul in limbo. He wasn't sure what Kashay could feel right now and what he couldn't. Focusing himself on the task at hand, he gestured for Kashay to open his mouth. The ancient legend did so as Kashay uncorked the late Karmav's elixir vial and poured it into the child's distorted mouth. Within seconds, the childlike form began to glow with a blinding white light similar to that of the elixir itself. Rasputin had to look away as the trees cast writhing shadows on the trunks behind them. One of the rear guard blasted a helicopter out of the sky, and it crashed to the ground less than a mile away. No one batted an eye. The light show lasted a good 15 seconds or so. Suddenly, Rasputin felt a small package materialize in his hands. Puzzled, he opened it and saw that it contained two objects, a wand and an Atlantis ring. Rasputin grinned. Well, well. Unless he was badly mistaken, these two objects belonged to Kashay. He had no idea Kashay had been given an Atlantis ring. Having an Atlantis ring on their side would probably even things up a lot. Closing the package once more, he turned back to Kashay as the light began to fade. Standing before him was a man about 57 in height. He was wearing what appeared to Rasputin to be an archaic dress robe, which looked like something a college professor would have worn during a graduation. He was clean-shaven and had short gray hair. Rasputin watched as the man looked at his body in amazement and began pinching himself to make sure he was really there. Rasputin couldn't help but think that Kashay looked, well, like a college professor. Hell, the guy would have looked like a computer geek had he worn glasses. He vaguely remembered stories about Kashay having worked at Durmstrang and having once been a healer in the old days. Kashay beamed as he looked around the group. Finally, he punched his fist into the air and shouted one word. Everyone cheered and fell to their knees, and Rasputin bowed in respect. Rasputin, however, felt somewhat uneasy. It was fairly obvious that Kashay had given up on speaking to him in Middle Russian and had decided to switch to Latin. Although it made perfect sense for him to do this, Rasputin had to admit that his Latin was terrible. He knew a lot of Greek and Russian, but he hadn't done any work with Latin since his school days. He wouldn't get very far in his primary disciple campaign if he didn't know what the hell Kashay was saying. What Kashay did next didn't require any translation, however, as he abruptly embraced Rasputin in a bear hug which knocked the package from Rasputin's hands. Professor Boris Kashay looked at the people around him and at his body in amazement. Good Lord, that Horcrux had worked. He hadn't been entirely comfortable with creating one of the accursed things, but Grand Mugwump Zerin's thugs had been hounding him like crazy, and he'd had no choice. He had to stay alive until the time was right to stop that pandemic he'd created. Only by healing the Black Death would he be able to convince the world and Atlantis that he was qualified to rule the submerged city and introduce his political reforms. He hated to think how far the pandemic had spread, as he had never intended for it to get loose among the Muggles. To make matters worse, Atlanteans had had the temerity to put him out of commission, Olga, you moron, before he could actually try to stop it. What was that glowing white goo the gatekeeper had fed him to bring him back? It was a healing potion, obviously, but a healing potion strong enough to revive a man from a Horcrux. He certainly didn't know of anything powerful enough to do that. He made it a point to try to get more of that stuff. Perhaps he could use it the next time he tried a pandemic. Judging from the fighting his followers had had to endure while he had been sitting around in child form, it looked like Zaren's men had followed the gatekeeper here. He swore to himself. This gatekeeper must be an idiot if he let Atlantis in on the existence of Booyan again. However, he owed whoever this fellow was, Grigori, something a tremendous debt of gratitude. He was a bit surprised that no one here spoke Russian, particularly this Grigori fellow who certainly looked Russian to him. Those names, Karmov and Zyganova, how could a civilized woman wear pants, were Russian as well. And where had all these trees come from? The last time he'd been here, there had been lots of plowed fields here. Glancing at the mountaintop near him, he had a feeling that it was the mountain on the western side of Booyan, the one he called Mount Natasha after his wife. His first order of business was to help his men beat off these Atlantis thugs. They had to be from Atlantis. They were creating explosions which were far beyond anything the Muggles had been able to throw at them, unless they managed to do something with Greek fire. Those Romans were notorious for using that. He also couldn't figure out what those flying contraptions with spinning wheels on top of them were supposed to do. Were they a form of military transport for Atlanteans he hadn't known about? If they were, they weren't doing anyone any good, as they were being blasted out of the sky by his colleagues. He wondered whether the cult of the Black Guard still survived. He had never been a big fan of the cult, and to be honest, some of their rituals scared him. However, a politician often had to make sacrifices and do things he didn't like to get the job done. A new pandemic would likely kill a few thousand people, but this time he vowed to not let it get out of control. First things first, reintroduce himself to the world, get himself up to date. What was it? 1420 or something far off like that. And do what must be done to make Atlantis the worldwide leader. It had the potential to be Atlantis 1401Z. Dagger knew something was wrong as soon as he saw no fewer than 7 people from the Department of Prophecy running in his direction with Endukaku himself in the lead. Hoping it wasn't what he thought it was, he asked Endukaku what was going on. He was already having enough trouble now that damned tornado was making it almost impossible for his men to reach Rasputin. The head astrologer reached into his pocket and pulled out a small golden key with an eye on it. Dagger recognized it immediately, and his heart sank. There was only one reason he would be bringing out that key. Endukaku's face was grim. The latest apocalypsometer result just came back, 10.7. We've gone up 4.7% in a span of less than a minute. We haven't seen a jump that high since right before Judgment Day. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was somber. I think we know what that means, sir. Dagger nodded. I think you're probably right. A helicopter flying over the edge of the tornado caught a glimpse of a vivid flare of light, the color of the elixir of life's glow less than 30 seconds ago. It was shot down shortly thereafter. Endukaku gulped. That was just about the time we made our calculation. The two can't be a coincidence, sir. Dagger shook his head sadly. I don't think it is, and I know why you have that key out, my friend. Endukaku's tone of voice turned formal. Grand Mugwump, I, the head astrologer, report that the odds of the end of civilization are now in excess of 10%. The time has come to go to DEFCON 1. Do you concur? Dagger reached for his pocket and pulled out the Atlantis key. I concur. Follow me to the control panel so we can change the setting on the rings. The two men made their way down the corridor at the head of a growing crowd of onlookers. Everyone was silent. They knew what this meant. After all, they had seen it 6 months earlier. The two men inserted their keys in the panel and turned at them. The panel glowed red momentarily, indicating the transition to DEFCON 1. Dagger turned to one of the chief auras. Execute Operation Antidote. Did that helicopter report the position of that flash before it went down? The aura nodded. It did indeed, sir. We're going to throw everything we have at it. We've got a submarine trying to make its way underneath the storm, and we've got another series of missiles trying to make their way through the tornado. What about the B-2s? The Aura made a face. Out of action for a long time, they need to be refueled and reloaded. Dagger groaned. Wonderful, Hermione gasped as Flamel's Atlantis bubble suddenly turned opaque. What the hell? Flamel swore. Hermione, please don't tell me my bubble has also gone opaque. Hermione blinked. It has. What does that mean? Flamel hesitated, then let it out. It means DEFCON 1, which could only mean one thing. Karshe is probably back, and we're running out of time. We need to find that Horcrux and do it very, very soon. Let's hope it's not on the other side of that tornado. Minus 1,402 Z Laboratory of Infectious Disease Bethesda, MD. Dr. Samantha Davis nearly dropped her beaker in shock as three robed figures suddenly materialized in the room. Who are you? The woman reached into her robe and brought out a card with the insignia of the Department of Magic. My name is Teresa McGee, and I am an Aura from Enfield, Ma. I work for the Department of Magic. Davis blinked. You're a wizard. Technically, I'm a witch, not a wizard, but that's beside the point. We have come because we have reason to believe that there may be a magical threat against chemical and biological weapon stockpiles all over the world. We're here to make sure no dark wizards infiltrate this lab. Davis's brow furrowed. Does this have anything to do with what's going on in the Black Sea or Iraq? I'm afraid I can't answer that question, ma'am. I take it that you have a stockpile of infectious disease cultures here. Davis's mind raced. We do, but I'm not allowed in there. McGee cut us off. Take us there, and make sure that no one tries to enter it for the next few hours. If they do, we will not be held responsible for what happens to them.